The studio lights blazed down on the sleek, modern set of American perspectives tonight. The air was thick with anticipation, not just in the studio, but across millions of homes watching live. Tonight's debate was marketed as a discussion on leadership and policy, but everyone knew it would turn into something much bigger. At the center of it all sat Karoline Leavitt, poised and composed, ready for whatever came next. Across from her sat David Cross, a veteran journalist known for his relentless questioning. He had built a reputation for exposing weaknesses, pushing guests into uncomfortable corners until they had nowhere left to turn. But Karoline was different. She was sharp, unshaken, and never one to back down from a challenge. The crowd could feel it. This wasn't going to be a routine debate, it was going to be a battle. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation followed the expected script. They debated economic policies, government regulations, and social issues, exchanging carefully crafted arguments. Karoline answered every question with clarity, never stumbling, never faltering. She wasn't just speaking to David, she was speaking to the millions watching beyond the camera. Then, something shifted. David adjusted his chair slightly, a subtle but deliberate move. His eyes narrowed just enough for seasoned debaters to recognize he was preparing to strike. The energy in the room changed, tightening like a coil ready to snap. David leaned forward, his voice calm but sharp. "Karoline," he began, "you often talk about faith as a guiding principle in your leadership." He paused for effect, letting the tension build. But let's be honest, religion is declining in this country, and fewer people than ever believe in a higher power. A murmur rippled through the audience, as if they too had felt the shift in momentum. Karoline remained still, listening, waiting. David continued, his tone pressing forward like a blade. "Science has given us answers that faith never could, yet you continue to advocate for religion as if it's some universal truth. Why?" The studio fell into silence, heavy and expectant. Karoline didn't answer immediately, letting the question linger. She knew this wasn't just about her beliefs, it was a challenge to faith itself. Every person watching was waiting to see how she would respond. David didn't let up. There are millions of Americans who believe faith is nothing more than an outdated crutch, something that holds people back instead of pushing them forward. Do you think that's fair, or are you just unwilling to admit that faith is losing its place in modern America? The weight of his words pressed into the air, making the studio feel smaller. People shifted in their seats, the tension thick, unspoken. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion, every shift in expression. David had thrown a match into dry grass now. Everyone was waiting to see if Karoline would let it burn or extinguish it in a way no one expected. But Karoline didn't rush to respond. She took a breath, tilting her head slightly, a small knowing smile playing at the corner of her lips. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty, it was electric. She knew exactly what to say next. "You say faith is an outdated crutch," she said, her voice steady, "that it holds people back. But let me ask you something, David." She paused, letting the question land. "What do people turn to when science doesn't have an answer?" David's lips twitched, but he remained quiet. Karoline leaned forward slightly, her presence unwavering. "It's easy to dismiss faith when life is comfortable, when everything makes sense. But when the ground beneath you disappears, when your child is dying in a hospital bed, when you're staring at a casket, when the doctors say there's nothing more they can do, what do you reach for then?" The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was deafening. The audience was frozen, their breathing barely audible, their focus locked entirely on her. Even the producers, usually whispering behind the cameras, had stopped moving. Everyone was waiting for David's response. But for the first time that night, he hesitated. Finally, he adjusted his tie, his voice controlled. "People turn to faith because they're desperate. That doesn't make it real, it just makes it comforting." His words were sharp, but his delivery wasn't as sure as before. Karoline nodded, as if she had anticipated that response. "Comfort is not a weakness. It's human. And faith is more than just comfort, it's resilience, it's hope. It's the belief that even in the darkest moments, there's still meaning." David exhaled, shifting in his chair, but Karoline pressed on. "You can call that naive, but I'd argue it's the very thing that has kept people from collapsing under the weight of suffering for thousands of years." Her words were deliberate, measured, unwavering. "So yes, people turn to faith in desperation, but faith is what keeps them standing after everything else is gone." David gave a small, tight smile, shaking his head. "You're good, Karoline. But let's talk about facts." He gestured slightly, as if resetting the conversation. "Religious institutions have been responsible for some of the worst atrocities in history: wars, oppression, corruption. And yet you defend faith as if it's only ever been a force for good." Karoline's expression didn't change. I won't deny that people have done terrible things in the name of religion. But let's be fair, faith has also been the foundation for some of the greatest acts of courage, sacrifice, and kindness the world has ever seen. Her voice didn't waver, didn't rise, but it carried undeniable conviction. She met his gaze, unflinching. The abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, the countless hospitals, schools, and charities started by people who believed their faith called them to help others. She paused just long enough for the weight of those words to settle. You can't erase that just because some have twisted faith for their own agendas. David leaned back slightly, his eyes studying her, his mouth set in a firm line. He didn't have an immediate retort. And Karoline took the opportunity to lean in just a little more. But if you really want to know why I believe in faith, why I defend it, it's not because of history. It's not because of politics. Her voice softened just slightly, carrying something deeper now, something real. It's because of a woman I met 12 years ago. David's brows furrowed slightly. A woman. Karoline nodded. Her name was Margaret, and she taught me something about faith that no debate could ever shake. The audience leaned forward, drawn in not by performance, but by something rare. Even David, despite himself, was listening now, no longer just debating, he was hearing her. But no one, not him, not the viewers at home, not the thousands watching, was prepared for the story she was about to tell. Karoline rested her hands on the table, her fingers lightly interlaced. Her gaze didn't waver as she began speaking, her voice quieter now, more deliberate. 12 years ago, I was fresh out of college, working as a legislative assistant in Nashville. I spent my days in meetings, answering calls, drafting statements. Politics was everything to me back then. I thought policy was the most powerful force in the world. David remained silent, his posture rigid. The audience leaned in not because of theatrics, but because something deeper was unfolding. Then I met Margaret. Karoline continued. She was 72 years old. I met her at a community outreach event for seniors, one of those initiatives politicians love to show up to for a quick photo. She exhaled, as if the memory itself pressed against her. But Margaret, she stopped me in my tracks. David wasn't looking at his notes anymore. He was watching her. He was listening. And as Karoline prepared to share the story that would change everything, the entire studio held its breath. Karoline's voice softened, but her presence commanded the room. Margaret wasn't like anyone I had ever met, she said, her fingers resting lightly on the table. She had this quiet strength. Not the kind that came from speaking loudly, but the kind that came from enduring things that should have broken her. She didn't need to demand attention when she spoke, you just listened. David didn't interrupt, his usual sharpness momentarily replaced by something else. The audience, too, leaned in, their anticipation almost tangible. Karoline continued, her words careful but weighted. She had lived through more loss than most could imagine. She had buried 2 sons, one taken by cancer, the other killed by a drunk driver. She lost her husband to a stroke, had no siblings, no close family left. The studio was so silent, you could hear the faint hum of the lights overhead. I remember sitting across from her. Karoline said, exhaling slightly. I was 22, fresh out of college, full of ambition, and I couldn't wrap my head around how this woman who had lost everything could sit there, smiling, sipping her tea, and asking me how my life was going. David shifted in his chair, his fingers pressing into the armrest. And you asked her how? He prompted, his voice quieter than before. Karoline nodded, her expression thoughtful. I did. I asked her how she endured it, how she could wake up every morning with so much loss weighing on her heart and still find the strength to keep going. She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. And do you know what she told me, David? David didn't answer, but his gaze never left her. She said, faith isn't about proof. It's about what keeps you standing when there is no proof. The words landed like a hammer, sending a ripple through the audience. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. A man near the back swallowed hard. Even the camera operators who had seen thousands of debates seemed frozen in place. Karoline let the silence stretch, knowing its power. She told me that every morning she woke up and thanked God. She continued, her voice steady. Not because her life had been easy, not because she had been spared from suffering, but because she was still here, because she believed, even after everything, that there was still purpose in the days she had left. David exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening, and that was enough for her. Karoline met his gaze. It wasn't just enough, it was everything. A flicker of something crossed David's face, but he masked it quickly. So what are you saying? He asked, his voice carrying a slight edge again. That faith is just a coping mechanism. That it's what people cling to when they have nothing else. Caroline's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. You tell me, David, would you stand in front of Margaret and tell her that her faith is nothing more than a crutch? David's expression shifted just slightly, but enough for the cameras to catch it. He glanced toward the audience as if searching for something, then back at Caroline. For once, he didn't have a ready answer. Caroline leaned in just a fraction, her voice unwavering. You can argue facts, you can debate theology, but what you can't do, what no one can do, is look into the eyes of someone like Margaret and tell them that what has held them together through unimaginable pain is meaningless. David hesitated, his fingers tapping against the desk. I'm not saying it's meaningless, he admitted finally. I'm saying it's not universal. Not everyone finds comfort in faith. Caroline nodded. That's true. But everyone searches for something. Call it hope, call it resilience, call it whatever you want, but people don't survive life's darkest moments on reason alone. They survive because they believe in something, in anything that helps them take the next breath. David didn't respond immediately. He exhaled, rubbing his temple as if working through the weight of the conversation. The audience watched, waiting, caught between their own beliefs and the undeniable power of what had just been said. Caroline let the moment breathe before continuing. And that's why I defend faith, she said, her voice calm but firm. Not because I expect everyone to believe what I believe. Not because I think faith is the only way to find strength, but because I've seen what it does for people who have nothing else. And no debate, no argument, no statistics will ever change that. David's lips parted slightly, as if to say something, but he hesitated. For the first time in his career, he didn't have a counterpoint. The silence in the room wasn't awkward, it was alive. The weight of Caroline's words wasn't just felt, it was absorbed. The audience wasn't reacting in the way they usually did. There were no cheers, no applause, just reflection, just understanding. David finally let out a slow breath, sitting back in his chair. That's a powerful story, he admitted. But don't you think it's just that? A story. Caroline gave a small nod. Maybe, she said simply. But some stories change the way people see the world. David held her gaze for a long moment. And you think this is one of those stories? Caroline didn't hesitate. I don't think, David. I know. The audience sat still, processing the moment, the conversation, the depth of what had just happened. David's usual sharpness had been replaced by something else, something not quite surrender, but not quite victory either. And as the debate continued, the real battle wasn't about winning an argument anymore. It was about something much deeper, something neither of them had expected. The tension in the studio was unlike anything the audience had seen before. David Cross, the journalist who had built his career on dismantling arguments, sat quieter than ever. Across from him, Karoline Leavitt remained composed, her expression steady, as if she knew she had shifted the conversation into something far bigger than either of them. The audience wasn't just watching a debate anymore, they were witnessing a moment. David cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his chair. I'll admit, he said, his voice measured, that's a compelling perspective. But faith, Caroline, is built on something intangible. Hope, belief, emotions, things that can't be measured. You're asking people to put their trust in something they can't prove. Caroline exhaled slowly, as if giving his words the space they deserved. David, let me ask you something, she said, tilting her head slightly. Can you measure love? Can you put hope under a microscope? Can you quantify the exact weight of human resilience? David blinked, caught off guard by the question. The audience, too, seemed to inhale collectively, waiting for his response. He hesitated, but only for a moment. No, he admitted, but that's not the same thing. Isn't it? Caroline pressed gently, leaning forward just a fraction. We build entire lives around things we can't see or touch. We fight wars over freedom. We dedicate our lives to our children's futures. We cling to hope in the darkest moments of our lives. Faith isn't just about religion, David. It's about the unseen forces that shape everything we do. David exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as if trying to process the weight of her words. You're good, Caroline, he said with a small shake of his head. But I still can't help but think that faith has been used to manipulate, to control, to justify things that no rational person should accept. Caroline nodded, acknowledging his point. I won't deny that some have twisted faith for their own agenda, she said. People have used religion as a weapon, as a shield for hatred, as a tool for power. But tell me this, David, should we discard something entirely just because some have misused it? David tapped his fingers lightly against the desk, thinking. Caroline didn't wait for him to answer. We don't reject science because some have used it for destruction, she continued. We don't dismiss love because people have been hurt by it. We don't abandon hope just because it has let us down before. Faith is the same, it's not perfect, but that doesn't make it meaningless. David let out a slow breath, staring at her. The fire in his eyes had dimmed not because he had lost, but because he was wrestling with something he hadn't expected. The camera zoomed in on him, capturing a rare moment David Cross, the master interrogator, was considering. The audience sat in stunned silence, hanging on to every word, every flicker of movement. This was no longer a political debate. It was something raw, something human. Finally, David leaned back in his chair, his voice quieter than before. You really believe that, don't you? Karoline smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of certainty. With everything in me, she said simply. David studied her for a long moment, then exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He said, a faint smile pulling at the corner of his lips. I walked in this interview thinking I had all the answers, that I could break down your argument piece by piece. He let out a small chuckle, though it lacked its usual confidence. I wasn't expecting to walk away with more questions than I came in with. A murmur spread through the audience. Some nodded, others exchanged glances. Something had shifted. Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't press him further. She simply nodded. That's the thing about faith, David. It's not about having all the answers. It's about being willing to ask the questions. David exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Way said after a beat, I guess I have a lot to think about. The audience let out a collective breath, some even laughing softly, relieved by the honesty in his words. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about the rarest thing in modern debate, understanding. The host, who had been watching silently up until now, finally leaned forward. David, do you have a final thought before we wrap up? David looked at Karoline, then at the audience, as if weighing his words carefully. I think. He hesitated, then let out a breath. I think I've spent a lot of years dismissing faith because I didn't understand it. And maybe, just maybe, there's more to it than I've allowed myself to see. The room was still for a beat. Then, slowly, a few people in the audience started clapping. It wasn't a standing ovation. It wasn't wild applause. It was something better real. David turned back to Karoline. I won't say you changed my mind, he admitted. But you did something just as rare. You made me think. Karoline smiled. That's all I ever wanted. The debate ended moments later, but its impact was far from over. As soon as the cameras cut, social media exploded. Clips of the exchange spread like wildfire, dissected by commentators, analysts, and ordinary people alike. The reaction wasn't just from religious circles, it came from everywhere. I've never been religious, but that made me think. I expected another screaming match, but instead, I watched two people actually listen to each other. Faith isn't my thing, but I respect the way Karoline defended it without tearing anyone else down. Even some of David's usual supporters admitted that something had happened in that studio that night, something they couldn't quite define. And then the unexpected happened. The next morning, David Cross, who had remained silent since the debate, broke his silence with a single post. I've been in journalism for over 30 years. Last night was the first time I walked away from an interview realizing I had more questions than answers. That was it. No grand statement, no spin, just honesty. And it was enough to send another wave of conversation rippling through the country. But the real impact wasn't in the headlines or the trending hashtags. It was in the emails Karoline received from people who never thought they'd care about faith, but suddenly found themselves thinking about it in a way they never had before. One email stood out. I haven't stepped foot in a church in 20 years. I lost my faith a long time ago. But after watching your debate, I sat in my car and cried, not because I suddenly believe again, but because I realized something. I miss believing. I didn't even know how much until last night. Thank you for making me think. Karoline read it twice, then a third time. She had spent her career debating policies, fighting for causes, trying to change laws. But this was something else entirely. Because sometimes a debate wasn't about winning. Sometimes it was about planting a seed. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. In a world where people are too quick to argue and too slow to listen, this debate reminded us of something powerful. Understanding is more important than winning. Karoline Leavitt didn't change David Cross's beliefs in one night, but she did something even more valuable. She made him think. She didn't attack, she didn't ridicule, she simply shared a truth so real, so deeply human, that even the tough skeptic couldn't ignore it. And isn't that what life is about? We don't always have the answers. We wrestle with doubt, we search for meaning. We question everything. But faith, whether in God, in people, or in something bigger than ourselves, is what keeps us standing when nothing else makes sense. It's not about proving who's right. It's about having the courage to ask the hard questions and the humility to admit when we don't know everything. So the next time you find yourself in a conversation, don't focus on winning, focus on understanding. Because the most powerful changes don't come from shouting the loudest. They come from the moments that make people stop, listen, and say, I never thought about it that way before.